Thank you so much, everyone. Welcome to East to West presentation by Giovanni Reyes, who is going to be sharing with us some of their work that affirms their African ancestry in the context of their Afro-Indigenous Spanish and Caribbean roots. My name is Fabiola Torralba, and I'm the producer of the East to West project. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I am a migrant slash immigrant. I was born in Guerrero, Mexico, in La Costa Chica, what is known as a heavily densely populated region, also known as Afro Mexico. And part of the East to West project is my beginning to build a pathway towards building a solidarity movement in the U.S. with Afro Mexico, specifically with Afro Mexicans of the Costa Chica. In 2017, I was able to go down to different parts of the coast in Guerrero y Oaxaca to visit family and to make new friends and family. And while I was there, I was able to connect with many of the local organizers, cultural workers, artists, educators, dance makers, and talk about what their current cultural, political, social, cultural movement to affirm Afro-Mexicans presently, historically, and also for their contributions to Mexican society. So one of the kind of questions that I would ask everyone while on my way down the coast is how I could support Afro Mexico of the Costa Chica, and everyone responded with the need to be known, the need for others outside of Mexico to know of Afro Mexicanos, to know that we exist and that there's a community that has been in resistance, mobilizing, organizing for at least 3 decades. So I share this very humbly with that conocimiento that this work is a continuation, a starting point for some of us, but no less part of a broader trajectory that is about affirming our Afro and Indigenous roots.
The East to West Project centers the cultural expressions, politics, and histories of descendants of the African diaspora and the interconnections between Indigenous, Latinx, and Black communities. Program outline, introduction. We will start with Giovanni's presentation, then move into a Q&A between Giovanni and myself primero, y luego closing, followed by a Q&A between audience and Giovanni and myself, if you'd like, and then a closing. And then we have the space until about 8:30. I'm not gonna, I will be mindful of time because that is important to some folks. And then there's also this acknowledgement that time is fluid and that there are different concepts of time. So if anybody wants to say after 7:30 p.m., I'm happy to stay on and continue the conversation. Giovanni, totally up to you. Giovanni likes to talk a lot, so maybe there is an opportunity for otra conversación. So Giovanni Reyes is a 12-year U.S. Army veteran and member of the veterans-led anti-war organization called About Face, Veterans Against the War, and the Latinx Emancipation grassroots organization Mi Gente. He is of Dominican and Puerto Rican background and holds a master's in international relations and instructional technology. His presentation, Herencia, Affirming Africa in the Context of My Afro-Indigena Spanish Caribbean Roots, is questions these terms. Hispanic or Latino is not a race. It is a multicultural community linked together by history, language, politics, geography, and attitude. Nor are we all brown, as we are often referred to in the US when differentiating from Black, African American, and Latino. Rather, we are a rainbow of colors. As such, this presentation will delve into a part of the larger African diaspora that is often ignored by the Latino community and their African American brethren: Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Haiti. The goal is to promote a broader, holistic, and international perspective that challenges US centrism as we seek emancipation from the same oppressors here and above. Thank you so much, Giovanni Reyes. With that, Maestro, take it away.
Thank you for coming on the call, and also thank you for Fabiola for putting this together. And like Fabiola said, I got a content. I got a whole lot of things. I'm hitting a couple of countries from the Caribbean. That's where I'm from originally, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. As well, I'm going to other countries that influenced those two places, which namely Cuba and Haiti. So there's a lot of content, a lot of history, and I got 45 minutes to go through it. So I'm going to fly through a lot, but at the same time, the presentation is going to be available. I'll give it to Fabiola, so when she sends a follow-up email, you guys will be able to go back and look at the presentation as well. Also, I want to start with a poem, and I'm not a poet, right? But I think this poem is going to bring us into the mood. Pretty much what this call is going to be about. Also, I'll be playing a conga, and I'm not a conguero either, but this is a conga that was given to me by my uncle when I was a kid, and I always kept it as decor, house decor. Not even tuned, but just for the effect with the la poesía, I want to use a conga. So, la poesía se llama ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? It starts like this. Ayer me dijiste negro y hoy te voy a contestar. Mi mae se siente en la sala, pero ¿y tu abuela dónde está? Yo tengo el pelo caillo y el tuyo es cera nada más. Tu pai lo tiene lacio, pero ¿y tu abuela dónde está? Tu color te salió blanco y la mejilla colorada. Los labios los tienes finos. Pero ¿y tu abuela dónde está? Dice que mi bebé colorada. Pero dime por la Virgen, ¿y tu abuela dónde está? Como tu nena la saca a pasear. Y yo con ganas de gritarte, ¿y tu abuela dónde está? A ti te gusta el froté. A mí, el brusca maniguá. Tú te la traes de blanco. ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? Eres blanquito enchapado, que detrás en sociedad, temiendo que se conozca la mamá. Aquí el que no tiene dinga, tiene mandinga. Por eso yo te pregunto, ¿y tu abuela dónde está? Ayer me dijiste negro, queriéndome abochornar. Mi abuela sale a la sala y la tuya oculta está. La pobre se está muriendo al verse tan maltratada que hasta tu perro le ladra si acaso a la sala va. Y bien que yo la conozco, se llama Ciña Tatá. Tú la escondes en la cocina porque ella es prieta de verdad. That was the poesía negra Fortunato Vizcarrondo. And let me show you a presentation. So this poem has to do with the poem of denial and affirmation of the African identity, right? This poem, it's about a person que es negro. Es una poesía puertorriqueña. It's from Puerto Rico. And it tells a story of a Puerto Rican who answers to a white-skinned Puerto Rican after the latter calls him black and big-lipped, right? In his answer, the black man describes both his own attributes while also describing the Caucasian's attributes of the white Puerto Rican as that of the person with light-skinned daughter, right? All the while, the black man keeps asking in nearly every stanza, and where's your grandmother? Right? The meaning of the question is made clear as the poem develops. The black man notes that his grandmother sits in the living room, but the white Puerto Rican's one is hidden. The reason for that is revealed later in a stanza when the black man tells the world that the white Puerto Rican keeps his grandmother hidden in the kitchen because she is also of dark skin. We also learned that her name is Siña Tata, which is referring to an Afro Puerto Rican grandmother name, right? From back in the days. The poem is widely interpreted as an elegant way to identify the racism faced of people of clear African ancestry, both from their own people of Caucasian features, but who may also have ancestors themselves. And the things that it says, if you're not from Dinga, eres Mandinga, which make reference to African tribes, saying that somewhere around your bloodline you have someone from Africa too. That's pretty much what the poem is about. So one of the features are we all know the story behind Christopher Columbus, 1492, came to this country, came to the New World, and navigated the ocean blue. So the Caribbean was conquered by the Spaniards, and the Spaniards had this caste system, right? The caste system was based on pretty much how you looked, who your parents were, because the Catholic Church wasn't really as they fawned upon children living out of wedlock, unlike the Protestant Church in the North in the northern colonies, like i.e. U.S., Canada, and so forth, right? So one of the things is that they've put pressure on people when they had children to recognize those children, right? So out of those mixtures between Spaniards and the Indians, the natives, and the blacks, and everyone, right? These were pretty much the caste that was created, right? So a criollo was someone who was born, a European who was born in the colony. A peninsulare was someone who came from Europe, wasn't born in, he came from Europe. An indígena was a native of the land. A negro was an African or black. A mestizo was someone who's mixed between black and white and black, or mulatto, I'm sorry. A mestizo was someone who's mixed between white and indigenous. A samba was someone who's indigenous and black. A morisco was someone who's black and mulatto and black and white, and a castizo was someone who was mestizo and español. A mulatto was someone who's white and black. Those were the castes. It was a long list, but I just mentioned a few of them here. So out of all that came the mestizaje. So the original people inhabited the Greater Antilles were known as the Arawaks or the Taínos, and the Minor Antilles were people known as the Caribs. When the Spaniards came, they initially enslaved the indigenous population. They were after gold and other minerals, and they were after lumber and other stuff they can take back to Europe. So they used the indigenous people as their labor, saved them. A lot of the people that lived in these islands, and they have never seen these people in armor and white people with beard and whatnot. So a lot of them saw them initially as deities or some type of gods, right? So they didn't resist much. There was this famous cacique, which was a chief, in Puerto Rico. That's where the story of Diego Salcedo comes, where he kidnaps a Spaniard and drowns him and kills him. Right? By doing that, the myth of the Spanish being God and invincible is pretty much washed away. And then soon after that, you started having rebellions in Puerto Rico. There were rebellions in Dominican Republic as well, what we call Dominican Republic today. And there started rebellions in different places. Now, these are some of the caciques, the chiefs that led some of the rebellions in these islands. So where do our African influences come? So most of the Africans that came to the Americas, most of them came to the South, to the Caribbean and to the South. In fact, today Brazil has the largest African population, the largest Black population outside of Africa, and has the largest population second to Nigeria. So most of the people that came to the Caribbean, particularly the Spaniard colonies, came from these places that you're seeing right now, Congo and Carabalí. These places today are places like Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, Togo. A lot of them, they were from tribes called Yoruba and so forth. So most of the people came from these islands, right? That's why you see the name Congo and Carabalí, and it came from different periods, from the 1500s to 1700s. They came from this port of the Congo, and then from the 17th to the 18th came from this other port called Carabal. Now, depending on which power was transporting the Africans, that's where the port came from. Like the French came out of different ports, the Portuguese came out of different ports, and the English and the Dutch came out of different ports. So the indigenous people that were enslaved, many of them would run away. They would rebel. Many of them would die because of diseases and etc. There was this prior. There was this priest, this Catholic priest named Bartolomé de las Casas, who came in the early expeditions in the conquest of the Americas with the Spaniards. They had an important debate, and this debate is known as the debate between Las Casas de Sepúlveda. It happened in 1551. This debate was debating whether the indigenous people found in the Americas, whether they were humans or not. One of the things that the Spaniards, when they first came into the Americas and pretty much were encountered these people in these islands, one of the first things that came out in Christopher Columbus's diary was, these people have no soul. Why does these people have no soul? Because at the time, the Catholics, the Spaniards, they were very fanatical in Catholicism. And at the time, it was understood that only people that worshiped the Christian God had souls. People that didn't worship the Christian God had no souls. And since these people were not Christians, therefore they didn't have any souls. That was the idea. So they were treated as pests or vermin. So this debate took place in 1551, where Las Casas argued that these people were not fully developed humans yet. But they could be taught to be humans. You know, they could be converted, they can be guided, they can be like children. Sepúlveda said that they were vermin. So they had this debate. Las Casas won, and soon after, Spain banned the use of indigenous slave labor. And from that part, that's when the African transport started. A lot of our languages today are still in our religions and our stories are down from our African ancestors, because they brought their traditions and religions with them. Because depending who brought them, you know, whether they are the French or the Portuguese or the British and whatnot, they pretty much repressed these Africans that were brought to this part of the world. And these Africans had to live under a veil. What does that mean? They had to pretty much disguise their language. They had to disguise their culture. They had to disguise their traditions and religions under the dominant culture of their repressors or their slave drivers. So because of that, we have an Afro-Indigenous Latin in Latin America. I'm gonna show you some of these dances here. I want you guys to pick up some of the moves that this dancers are here and pretty much related to today. This is bomba puertorriqueña. Bomba puertorriqueña is it's what is called the African rhythm in Puerto Rico, the African based rhythm, and it was danced by the slaves that were in Puerto Rico. They were pretty much, they would have the ceremonial dances. A lot of them has religious significance. At night, you know, they would meet and they have these dances and these bombas, far away from the house of the Lord or the slave masters. So I'm gonna put it right now so you can see some of the patterns, some of the beats. The bomba de Puerto Rico. Again, these rhythms, this bomba is an African word, and they were ceremonial at the time of slavery. Now I'm gonna go shift to Palo Dominicano and just see some of the differences, some of the similarities between these dances. Keep in mind that although the slave tramper came from a particular area, a lot of them were from different tribes themselves. Some of them spoke different languages among from their particular tribes, the particular people, and they were in the Americas. They were separated by islands, so there's could be little differences between them, but for the most part, there's a lot of similarities. This is Palo Dominicano. Okay, and this is Rumba Guanguanco Cubana. So that was Guaguancó Cubano. So title of this slide here is Africa is sazón. Sazón means our flavor, our seasoning, and no doubt that's what pretty much give us the Caribbean Latinos. That's what gives us our spice. These dances that you just saw here also influence more modern dances. Modern dances like mambo, salsa, merengue, bachata, cumbia, reggaeton, and others that are popular today. Although these people were enslaved, they were exploited, and today people of African descent, and not only in the Caribbean, but pretty much wherever there's people of African descent, they're also exploited and so forth, right? No doubt that these rhythms make it to the metropolis, to the mainlands, make it to the U.S., makes it to France, makes it uh, to the British Islands, and it's seen as very popular in those settings, and one of the things that comes to mind is that people of African descent, have the opportunity to be elitists, right? So people of non-African, that's when we come down to cultural appropriation and so forth, right? Has long assimilated and appropriated those cultures of people of African descent, and they pretty much integrated it in their own throughout the years. In the American context, I can think about jazz and blues and hip hop. So language still live with us today also. In the left column, you'll see Taino languages, Taino words that are still used today in our language, and also has been also in other languages as well, and you'll recognize some. And also to the right corner, to the right column, you'll see African words that we still use today, and it's also has made it to other languages as well. Some of the example, tiburón is a shark. That's a Taino word. Anoa is a canoe. Guaraguao, that's the name of the hawk. Jaiba, which is a small crab. Barbacoa, you know it as barbecue. Caulla, which is a string. Ají, that's what we call chile, or we call pepper. Huracán, you guys know it as hurricane. Hamaca, that's a hammock. And iguana, semi, which is a small god, right, a minor god. Today we use it as semi, which is a kite. Conuco, which is small plot. In the African column, you have bachata, bembe, which is the party, bembe, bongo, cachimbo, which is a cigar or pipe, cocolia, and fucharse, which is getting mad, fofu, which is when someone put a curse on you, tostón, which is fried plantain, pachanga, people call it pachanga, cumba, that's where word cumbia came from, revolú, which is a mess, a big fight. So my political formation, where did it come from? Pretty much growing, I've started becoming political aware at least I think since I was probably 14 and 15. Mostly when I was living in Puerto Rico, transitioning, coming to the United States. So just noticing the contradictions of this, um, learning about the deeper histories of the places I'm from, mainly Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, education, focusing on the histories and societies, questioning why there's so many people migrating to the United States. That's one big question I've always had that's influenced my political thought. My role in the military has deep impact in my political thought. Learning about the places we've been, learning about colonialism, racism, militarism, understanding empire and colonialism, and all that I've become a Marxist in the way I view the world. So colonialism is something that is being talked about more and more these days, particularly in the movement groups when people talk about colonialism. So I want to give a quick definition of what colonialism is. Um, it could be defined as the extraction and exploitation of resources and transfer of from one place to another. And this other place that's being transferred is the metropolis, usually from the lands that's being exploited to the metropolis, right? These are the types of colonialisms there are. Settler colonialism. I can give you an example of settler colonialism. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, they all settle colonialism. Examples of settle colonialism. Classic or extractive colonialism. We saw that in the 20th century, where pretty much the majority, all of the African, what we call African countries today, all of them were pretty much under colonialism. They were extracting the wealth out of the African continent to Europe. Surrogate colonialism, right? That's when someone else is colonializing and the is supporting the settlement of other people in other people's land. Neocolonialism, that's the word. That's what we live in today. We have a lot of countries in the global south are under the neocolonialist regime, is where wealth is extracted from those land to go into the wealthy countries, whereas they be by minerals, raw materials, or just labor. Then you have internal colonialism. Those are colonial. Those are examples of places here inside the metropolis, inside society, where one set of society is benefiting the labor or benefiting from the resources coming out of another sector of society who are not benefiting from that. Examples could be the minority communities, underpaid people, people that are working in the the chicken poultry factories, or people in West Virginia working in the coal mines, etc. And then you have colonialism, right? I just threw that in there, and that's pretty much the colonialism that exists in people's mind, inside people's head. And some of the works that you can read to go more into depth about colonialism is Malcolm X, Franz Fanon, Albert Memmi, W.E.B. Du Bois. And that has a very deep impact, because out of that class of people are colonial, the psychological colonialism can damage a lot of the inside of a person. Like Franz Fanon says, that the person who's colonized always think about the worst of his own people and always want to be like the colonizer. Those type of dynamics that happen in people's mind. So this is where I'm from. I'm from these two places here. Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. The arrow shows the towns or the province where I'm from. Quisqueya, which is the name, the indigenous name of what we call today Dominican Republic, mother of all lands. Que lo que so Dominican second largest is part of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, which make one island. It's the second largest island in the Caribbean. They were settled by Taínos. When Columbus arrived, they had cacicazgos, which is 5 fiefdom or kingdoms that were being governed by different caciques. The name that Columbus originally gave it was Española, but later on it was changed to Santo Domingo in honor of a patron state. By 1530s, the pretty much of La Española was complete. However, conquest of Mexico and Peru diverted population, so a lot of people started going to, a lot of Europeans, a lot of Españoles, those areas, because they were wealthier places. Because of that, you have pirates started to use the western side of the island as bases, rest areas and whatnot. Then it was soon followed by a French colonizer. So by the time the Spanish were able to react, and because they had in Europe they had conflicts between the Spanish and the French, by the time they were able to react, there was already a French population in the western side of the island that was ceded French, and that became Saint Dominique Francois, which is the French Santo Domingo. Today we know it as Haiti. The Haitians invaded the Spanish Santo Domingo in 1801 to secure the port during the Haitian Revolution. Then they invaded again in 1822, and that time they unified the island and freed the slaves. So Dominicans gained their independence from the Haitians in 1844, and again for a second time in 1860s. This was called the War of Restoration, when the second independence of the Dominican Republic was led by Gregorio Luperón. After the second independence, they fell into political instability. The criollo cacicazgos, which is powerful families, were pretty much governing or running, controlling lands, and they were controlling like a little fiefdoms. And this man, he was a black general during the War of Restoration. His name is Ulysses Hero. What's important about Ulysses Hero is that he was able to, ruthlessly, he was able to pretty much beat down the other caciques, cacicajos, the other powerful families, and pretty much dominate them, and put him under his control, and creating for the first time political stability in the island for the first time. Under his reign, that's when you started seeing the rise of the sugarcane industry and the tobacco industry. Hero was assassinated in 1889, and when the assassination happened, the country again fell into political crisis. Again, the United States invades in 1916 to restore stability after his death, Herox's death, and to control the banks and the ports, because the United States had, during Hero's reign, put a lot of money in extracting sugarcane from wealth and other materials and mines and minerals from the Dominican Republic. So they invade and secure and invest the banks, right? The thing about this was curious about this is this happened during the time where in the United States, Jim Crow was, was at his peak, so these soldiers were mainly a white army, came to the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 24, and they had those same attitudes towards blacks in the U.S. They had the same attitude towards people of color and the blacks of the Dominican Republic as well. So soon a guerrilla ensued, which they would call a gavillero, and other insurgents, and they resisted the occupation throughout the whole time that the U.S. Army was there. While the army was there, they remade the country. They remade its institution. They created an army. They put people in political power that they approved of, and they left pretty much a subservient institution behind that served American capital. And we'll talk about in the next slide. We'll talk about this person, Rafael L. Trujillo, which, if you want to understand contemporary Dominicans today, you have to understand it from the context of Trujillo, the era of Trujillo. Trujillo was in power for 31 years, and he was one of the soldiers that enlisted in the army that the Americans created in the Dominican Republic during the 16 to 22 occupation. And he rose the ranks really fast from soldier all the way up to general. In fact, he was favored by the American ambassador at the time to pretty much govern the country. there was a period where political instability came back. There was a president. There was a president that was seems like to be losing control of the country. So he was pretty much given the okay to overthrow his president. He was the general of the army, and he took power. And he went a junta of generals, and then he became the president of of the Dominican Republic. And became that's the time of the dictatorship of Trujillo. Now he's considered one of the most brutal dictatorship in the world, and also and by far the most brutal in the Western Hemisphere. One of his first, the Parsley Massacre, which pretty much killed 30,000 Haitians in 8 days. That's one of the first atrocity recorded. You probably won't hear much about Trujillo these days because Trujillo, to the Dominican Republic, to the United States context, right? He was a staunch U.S. ally, and he was an anti-communist. Also, he was a white supremacist as well. It is said that he would use creams and whatnot to make himself whiter. But under his rule, the country also modernized faster as well, because especially during the Second World War, where a lot of the resources were put into production in the Dominican Republic was to support the Allies when it came to meat, foods, different things was to support the Allies. So they brought a lot of income into the country. So that's one of the areas that today a lot of Dominicans that have nostalgia to the Trujillo area will say that during the Trujillo area, that was the best economic time that the Dominican have ever been in. The roads were being made, the trains ran on time, everything was being made. So today there's a lot of Trujillistas within the Dominican Republic, but he's left a deep psychological impact on Dominicans today. And like I said earlier, to learn to know Dominicans, you have to use it in the context of Trujillo. He was assassinated. FDR, not FDR, but Kennedy, pretty much greenlighted his assassination. He was being an embarrassment at the time. He ordered the assassination of the Venezuelan president Betancourt at the time, because Betancourt was putting pressure on the United Nations to put sanctions on the Dominican Republic, right, for the atrocities and criminalities that were happening in the Dominican Republic and abroad. So they came in a context of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, where the Kennedy felt that where Cuba also had a dictator named Batista, which was overthrown by the revolutionaries, and what Kennedy wanted to preempt that to happen in the Dominican Republic. So he pretty much gave the green to take out Trujillo, and that was done in 1961 by CIA operatives, CIA assets that were pretty much inside his inner circle. There were some of his generals, in fact. After that came the election in 1964, very important. That was the first democratically election in 40 years, where a progressive by the name of Juan Bosch was was voted in power. He was a progressive and a reformer and a leftist. His governments only lasted 9 months because he was overthrown by the generals and by the elite families and the Catholic Church that had a lot of influence and power in the Dominican Republic. After that came the revolution, 1965. The army split. Young officers went with the people, the popular forces, and they were fighting under the leadership of Camaño, Francisco Camaño, against the pro-Trujillo military. U.S. sends 40,000 troops to invade in 1965 to defeat the revolution and prevent another Cuba in the Dominican Republic. U.S. installs a former Trujillo vice president, Joaquin Balaguer, as interim president, and then helps him win the election. And after that, we hear about the 12 años, los terribles 12 años de Balaguer, los terribles 12 años, which is the first 12 years of the Balaguer presidency, where he targeted political enemies and pretty much took control. He was part of the right-wing Christian Democratic Party, and he governed for about 22 years after that. Now we go into Puerto Rico, land of the valiant and noble Lord. Que la que hay. Now, Puerto Rico is the oldest colony in the world, ongoing colony in the world. Since 1493, it has belonged to someone. It's currently is a U.S. colony. Now, you may hear Puerto Ricans call themselves each other Boricua, which is the Borican was the name that the indigenous gave to the land that we call Puerto Rico today. Um, there were there are three main political persuasions. There's the statehood party, the independence party, and the status quo party, right? The Grito del Lare is very important in Puerto Rico history because for the first time, the people that rose up against Spain colonialism, right, did it in the context of a common Puerto Rican identity. After the war of the Spanish-American War, uh, the Spanish-American War, which pretty much took out the Spanish out of Cuba, Puerto Rico became war booty because Puerto Rico was also invaded, and also the Spaniards were ran out of Puerto Rico as well. And that's when the Puerto Rico became a U.S. colony. The Jones Act would decree U.S. citizenship on Puerto Ricans, and that came at a time where the First World War was brewing. There was a need of soldiers, and the Jones Act came just in time to recruit a lot of Puerto Ricans into the U.S. Army and sent them out to fight in the European theater. Um, Puerto Rico is officially an unincorporated territory. What does that mean? That means that when the United States were doing westward expansion, like for example, when it was taking territories from the indigenous like Ohio, Indiana, etc., right? Those territories were incorporated territories, which means that when those territories were settled with enough settlers from the east, they could be allowed to come into the union, or they were pretty much encouraged to come into the union to become a state. When you have unincorporated territory, that means that the state would not, that territory is not going to be incorporated into the union. There's a lot of islands in the Pacific, uninhabited islands in the Pacific, that are in the same status. They're unincorporated to the territory of the United States. And that Congress has sovereignty over all the territories. So Congress has sovereignty over Puerto Rico. U.S. For the Spaniards, the U.S. was the key of the Americas because of its because of its geographical positioning coming out into Atlantis, and for the United States as well. From the United States, from Puerto Rico's strategic value because it could patrol the Caribbean. It also could defend the canal. Today, that crisis, the Hurricane Maria, and then now we have a second mass migration to the United States. So these are the próceres of Puerto Rico. We call it próceres: Eugenio María de Hosto, Ramón Emiterio Betance. Eugenio María de Hosto is called Antillano because he wanted to establish a confederacy amongst Latin Caribbean countries into one country, state. You have Mariana Bersetti, Lola Rodríguez de Tío, José Celso Barbosa, which was a black man. At the time, he was one of the few blacks in the United States to earn a medical degree, and he was the first Puerto Rican to earn a medical degree from a U.S. University. He was also the founder of the statehood party. He was against Spanish colonialism, but he was for Puerto Rican statehood. As compared to the man next to him, Luis Muñoz Marin, which was his rival, he was for independence. This is another person that I want to that is relevant to the United States. His name is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, and he was also a pro independence Puerto Rico, but independence from Spain at the time. And there was the delegation of Puerto Ricans and Cubans in New York organizing against the Spanish colonies of the country to win freedom from them. He was in that group as well, and he was living in New York. Today, he's known pretty much as one of the fathers of Black history because he had a collection through his time in New York. He died in New York as well. He acquired a collection of over 10,000 documents, arts, books, and historical material from the African diaspora. And he curated this collection at the Harlem branch of the New York Library until his death. Today, his collection is still being displayed in New York. Albizu Campo is also a person, a very importance in the independence struggle. He was a lieutenant during the First World War. When he came back, he joined the Nationalist Party. He first felt racism and while he was in the army because he was put into him and his friend was both joined the military at the same time. Because of his friend being lighter, he was put into a white unit, and because he was darker, he was put into a black unit. So that's the first time he's seen that type of racism, and he grew up with this other person. So it pretty much changed his view of the United States, and he pretty much changed his view of the relationship of Puerto Rico with the United States. He's also the first Puerto Rican who graduated from Harvard. He was inspired by the Irish independence movement that won Irish independence in the 1920s, and he wanted to overthrow the American rule of Puerto Rico as well. Through the 30s and the 50s, they were pretty much the most bloodiest era in the Puerto Rican relationship in the independence movement of Puerto Rico. You see that one of the pictures there was a shootout between nationalists and the FBI. There were a lot of repression against pro-independence people. That's the first wave of migration from Puerto Rico to the United States. There were attacks on the Capitol Hill, and it was actually the second time the United States Air Force bombed its own citizen. The first time was in Tulsa, the Tulsa Rebellion, where at the time the Army Air Corps bombed Tulsa, and Puerto Rico was the second time in 1950 where the U.S. Air Force bombed the town of Jayuya, who was being controlled by the nationalists. Muñoz Marin was the first Puerto Rican governor elected. Until 1948, all of the Puerto Rican governors were appointed by Congress. So he was the first one elected by the people of Puerto Rico. He was from the Socialist Party, or First Party. He is the son of Luis Muñoz Rivera. He established the concept of Estado Libre Asociado. He founded the Popular Democratic Party. He also helped suppress the nationalist insurgency. He also, during his time, that's when Puerto Rico was in a way of industrialization. His common thing was a la harda, because at the time, all the capital, La Harda, was the mountains, was the countryside, because most of the capital in Puerto Rico at the time was in the San Juan area, and the Puerto Ricans that lived in the countryside was very impoverished. And what he wanted to bring the industry, he wanted to bring modernization into the people that live in the countryside. So that was his call, a la Harda. He freed Abisu Campo from prison right before he left office, and right before Abisu was died. And you saw that this picture right here in the far corner. That's Abisu in the cell in the cell. Puerto Rico today, one of the things you probably heard about the debt crisis. Puerto Rico was industrialized through the 1950s, and in part was as a response to Cuba, to the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban model of development was socialism, and the Americans wanted to counter that narrative of socialism with capitalism. So they pretty much intentionally industrialized Puerto Rico, put a lot of power, which is contradicting, because they put a lot of money into industrializing Puerto Rico to counter the narrative of the Cubans. And Puerto Rico pretty much became a showcase for the newly independent world, the newly countries that are coming out of for independence to follow, instead of the Cuban model, instead of and so forth, right? But in the 1980s, the section in the tax law called 936 was repealed, and that was a tax clause that allowed for American companies to go to Puerto Rico in industry factories and pretty much not be taxed on their revenue, not be taxed on their income, right? So they were able to make as much money as they wanted and not be taxed on it. So that was repealed in '85, and that came into effect in the in 2000s, around 2003, and that's when we started seeing a lot of factories leaving Puerto Rico, and they were going to other places, mainly one being China, Vietnam, Haiti, and other places, right, to exploit labor. And there was a huge um, loss of jobs around that time. About 40% of all the manufacturing jobs were lost. So that's where you started. Puerto Rico started going into the debt crisis from there. El carpeteo was a scandal where you had a lot of where the FBI and the Puerto Rican government were pretty much doxing people from the Independence Party, of people from independent sentiments. They were doxing them, and they had a huge files over 10 million files on people who were sympathized with the Independence Party or with independence. Today we have roughly about 80 billion in debt. This has led to a grayscale gentrification in Puerto Rico, because a lot of Puerto Ricans, before Maria, about 200,000 Puerto Ricans left the island. A lot of people went to foreclosure. And now you're seeing people from here, wealthy people from here, going down there and just buying up everything they can. You saw last year or the year before that, when last year, the governor, Enrique Rosselló, from the statehood party, through mass mobilization, like you see in the camera, like you see down in the picture, was pretty much driven out of office. So this is Haiti. Like I mentioned earlier, Haiti was the first truly republic in the Americas. The slave rebellion was the first successful slave rebellion that overthrew the French, defeated the French twice, and defeated they ran the Spanish away from Santo Domingo Spanish, and they pretty much unified the island. Today, that period has a lot of impact, particularly the time when they occupied from 1922 to 1944. So there's a lot of resentment against the Haitians. There's about 1 million Haitians living and working in Dominican Republic today, but they work under precarious conditions, very exploited by the Dominicans. Cuba. Cuba also became a de facto colony of the United States after the Spanish-American War from 1898 until 1959 with the revolution. It pretty much changed the game between the relationship between Cuba and the United States. Up to that point, Cuba before had coups, had generals, had dictatorship, had all that, but all of them, they didn't touch American economic interest in the island. So the United States was pretty much fine with whatever political changes were happening in Cuba, as long as they didn't touch American economy, finances, and whatnot. And also, the Cuban Constitution had this thing called the Platt Amendment, which gave the United States the authority to intervene in American in Cuban events or Cuban situations. Whenever they felt the American interests were being threatened. With the Cuban Revolution, that pretty much changed everything. Not only was the government of Batista ousted, also the gangsters and also the American corporations that were exploiting Cuba was also pretty much sent home packing as well. Cuba been on a U.S. embargo since 1961 to this day. It's like pretty much the longest embargoed country in the world, and that has something with that they share a similarity with Haiti, because Haiti also, after the Haitian Revolution, when they overthrew the French, they were embargoed also by all the slave countries. They were, and it was Lincoln actually that brokered a deal between the Haitian government and the French, where the Haitians had to pay lost revenues to the French if they were going to be able to be allowed to enter the international realm again. And that payment kept going into the 1940s. That's when the Haitian paid their last debt to the French for the sin of independence. And this is me and my family. It's mainly from my mother's side. Couldn't find a lot of picture from my dad's side to put in, but this from my mother's side is me when I was a kid. And I put there the places that pretty much have influenced my journey towards embracing my blackness. When I moved to Virginia, that was pretty much the first time I saw in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. There's a knowledge of our societies being Black African based, but at the same time, there's a lot of denial. There's a lot of colorism. And colorism is the idea of the lighter you are, the better treatment you get. And I've seen that also in the Black community here in the United States, colorism, where people of lighter skin tone are favored versus the people of darker skin tone. Puerto Rico felt that. But when I moved to Virginia, it was different because now I saw that the black kids in the school that I went to, not only were they black, right, but they were proud to be black. When I was in Puerto Rico, I wasn't really proud to be black in Puerto Rico. But when I came to Virginia, pretty much I discovered my blackness in Virginia and I affirmed my blackness in Virginia. And since then, pretty much identified Latino since then. And that's the end of my presentation.
Giovanni, thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you to everyone. So this next part of the presentation, I know that Giovanni was going to ask me a question, I was going to ask Giovanni a question, and then we're going to open up the space to other participants. So I'll go ahead and start with my question, which I haven't really thought about how to formulate, but given that we do live in a military city, right? What some people, San Antonio, and I'm calling from San Antonio, Yanaguana, land of Payaya, Coahuiltecan, and Apache. So San Antonio, to many people locally, is known as an internal or internalized colony because of our missions. We have several that kind of have staked their presence in different parts of what is now San Antonio, the city, but that set up their presence early on as a way to colonize the land and colonize the people, indigenous and Afro descendant through slavery. We also are heavily influenced by the military industrial complex, and with that comes also our participation in the militarization of not only public space here in the city of brown and black bodies, indigenous bodies, migrant bodies, but also our affiliation to the detention and the militarization and the forced removal that is taking place along the border to land and other bodies that are moving through that space. So I grew up in the West Side. I went to Memorial High School. Our mascot is a Minuteman, which I'm not particularly sure where that image comes from. I know it's related to war, maybe to Civil War, but I've always kind of grown up really kind of intrigued how early on, just in school, we were very much trained to there's this kind of like naturalization of military culture, militarism, that I think I at least grew up with. And I'm not sure if it's the school, if it's the city, if it's a class or race thing, but what would you, Giovanni, as somebody that has a conciencia about colonization and the role that military plays in that, what would you say to the jovencitos, the young people, the black, the brown, the indigenous, the working class white youth and adults who want to join the military for whatever reason, often because it's an option, sometimes the only option? How do you live in those two worlds?
All right. So to that question, I say that the quickest way to in this capitalist system that we live in, hyper individualism that we live in, the quickest way to go from the middle class, from being in poverty to the middle class, is through the military. Now, in the United States, the way this class structure, the class system work is that poverty is seen as a dirty word, and most people don't want to associate themselves with poverty, with poor, right? They always they want to associate themselves with wealth. So it frustrates a lot of people that wants to get something but it cannot get something. So now you have a lot of other things like crime and so forth. But to go into that question is that because we live in the United States, and Black people make about 12% of the population. Latinos make about 16% of the population, right? And there's a lot of poverty among our communities, right? We're pretty much vulnerable for military propaganda and to lures, and we're pretty much seduced into the military. I talk to people. I've asked them why you joined the military, and they're telling me, "Well, I used to work in this fast food restaurant, and one guy I went to high school with bought a car, had a nice car, you know." And so I wanted a nice car too. So so we got attachment to these things and everything. So it's easy to lure us into the military. The thing is that when we're in the military, we got to realize that the military is the armed wing of the state, and we live in also not only in a capitalist country, we also live in an imperialist country, right? In an empire. And when we project power, we project imperial power, right? So what you're doing is, right, you're becoming the arm of the state, and when you deploy, you project power to other countries, and mainly those countries are black and brown countries, right? So what you're perpetuating here is, right, and the reason you're doing it is because you want to exploit those resources as well. So that we go into colonialism there, right? You want to put those countries into your domain, to your reign. So that's what imperialism is. An empire is when you go outside of your territorial jurisdiction and you exercise your power over other people in other territories and outside of your jurisdiction. So that's what you're doing when you join the military. So I'll tell people, young people, black and brown people, people, Asian people that pretty much are children of empire, or not children of empire, but yeah, children of empire too, but the harvest of empire. That think about when we think about justice and exploitation, think about what you're doing. Think about when you go to these lands like Afghanistan, of Iraq. What exactly are you doing? You might think that you're doing a good thing, but the people sending you there, they don't give two rats about the people that you're being deployed to. So think about those things, and I'm gonna end with the phrase that one of my friends, Ramon Mejia, said that when he joined the Marines, he wasn't following the news. So he had no idea about what was happening in Iraq. He just joined the Marines and got deployed and saw everything. That was his political formation with his deployment in Iraq. When he got back, he refused to not know again, and that's powerful to me. He refused to not know again. So I tell people to, open your eyes and don't believe the hype.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. So would you like to open up the space to other participants, or did you want to ask? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone. And let's just do it popcorn style. And so feel free to speak as you feel called to do so.
I'll ask a question. Can people hear me?
Sí, Camilo, gracias. Bienvenido.
Gracias. Great presentation. I'm sorry I was late, but I was just watching an RT video with Jorge Arriaza, the foreign minister of Venezuela, talking about how Iranian oil ships just days ago broke through the blockade of the United States on Venezuela with help from a NATO member, Turkey. Some people are calling that the end of U.S. hegemony in Latin America, or at least the beginning of the end of U.S. hegemony in Latin America. On the other hand, we have this pandemic there is this policy to keep people on lockdown, which is a policy that may work well in developed countries, but not necessarily in Latin America, where huge percentages of the population rely on their day-to-day labor to put food on the table. And so we're also seeing massive uprisings and really crude military repression against the people who are basically protesting because they're hungry, they're unable to work, and they're being repressed by the security apparatus, which is tied to IMF and World Bank loans to further indebt those countries and ensure that neoliberal policies are observed. With these two things happening, and this question is for both of you, what do you think is the state of U.S. hegemony in Latin America? What can we expect to see?
You want to go to Fabiola?
I'm not sure that I. What is the state of U.S. hegemony in Latin America? I see the U.S. and all other first world, if you want to use that language, um, superpower countries. I see us as leeches, in that we're totally dependent on the labor, the resources, the exploitation, on colonialism. We're totally dependent on that, so much that we don't know how to function outside of that, and what we're seeing right now during COVID is a clear reflection of that. I I think that throughout Latino American history, we have seen definitely, or I have and have been inspired by, um, social movements and the capacity of the people to dismantle, challenge, and maintain their own practices and generate new, um, visions for a just society. I I I don't see us unleashing, if that's a word. I don't see us unleashing very soon. I don't think that we are aware or are prepared for any other alternative than how we've been functioning, so far. The little that I know from science and what we've seen from other kind of social movements is that things don't change until something, is forced to. And I don't see us being forced to the extent that it would require further for us to lose our power in the way that we have it now. I think we're um yeah, we're so embedded. We're so embedded, and I don't see it. I don't see it getting better. That's my opinion.
Yeah, see the going to Camilo about U.S. hegemony in in Latin America. Now, if you the United States sees Latin America as its backyard, as pretty much as its property. You probably heard that term before, backyard, and you own your backyard. But one thing Cuba has resisted, for the last 60 years. So in essence, Cuba pretty much have fought for its sovereignty and kept it. Now you're seeing Venezuela is right now under distress, under besieged, because it's trying to exercise its own sovereignty, um, its own right to non-intervention and right to its own sovereignty, right? So now you start seeing more of this now. You saw this in the early 2000s with other countries also exercise their right. They have these governments, Correa, Lula, and others. For the first time in Latin America, you had governments that put the top agenda as advancing and going towards the needs of their people versus how it's been done before. Whereas under the old model, the capitalist neoliberal model is you first look out for the investments you look of foreign countries before you look after your people. Now, with the governments of South America, in the early 2000s, you saw that for the first time, change. You saw that their priority was to lift poverty out of the country, not so much foreign capital. So you saw why they're one by one they're being deposed and overthrown and so forth like that. So far, Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua has been the three that have resisted this pressure from the United States, right? And the fact that they're resisting, they're giving an example to others to do the same. And you're seeing the unraveling of U.S. hegemony not only in Latin America but also in the world. You saw in Syria, the United States couldn't have its way in Syria. You saw in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had been in Afghanistan for 20 years, but the Taliban haven't let up yet in Afghanistan. So you see in Iraq, you see in Iran. Iran pretty much defied U.S. embargoes. The first time that a southern country, what we call global South, pretty much defied the orders of a powerful country, the United States, and crossed the Atlantic and brought aid to another poor country, Venezuela. Despite the threats of, if you do this, we'll use military actions, and what Iran did, right? Iran said, do your worst, and kept on going. So we're seeing this shift in power. You've seen this shift in power. Not too long ago, the president of China said in the UN, we don't want to live under a unipolar system. Unipolar means one power, and we're not trying to go into multipolar system. We want a plural polar system, right? A system where there is no hegemon. A system where every country, every country is as equal with the other country, the rest of the country, and that's the goal. So we're seeing that shift right now in our very own eyes. This government, the one we have right now, this president, right, because of his behavior and his policies, right, it's accelerating this process of losing power, losing control of world affairs, right? I mean, if we get another Obama, that probably would prolong it a little bit longer, but this president is pretty much accelerating, pretty much burning bridges, and pretty much digging a deeper hole to American hegemony in the world.
Such a hard question, and how do you inspire hope? I think that's I would say anyways that for those of us that are living in the U.S. And I'm naming myself, I think that it is our responsibility to figure out how do we inspire hope, or how do we, if not hope, in solidarity support Latino America and everybody that is fighting against imperialism, because ultimately, if you live in the U.S., regardless of your background, or I would say for most of us anyways, I can't speak for everyone, but the privileges that we have here are because of the exploitation that we have done and continue to do in other countries. And so something, I guess, why I think I'm not as optimistic about the US losing its power in Latino America is because I'm seeing the displacement that, so it's like, not only have we are we like extracting resources, and we've been meddling in other people's economies and countries and setting up their infrastructure to benefit us in the US, but now we're also displacing people, and displacing people on a massive scale, because of political policies, and also because of environmental degradation. And this is also in relation to Blackness and indigeneity, and migration, right? Because we see that murders against, for example, environmental activists are increasing, and people are losing their rights, and Black and brown bodies continue to be displaced from their homelands. And so that's what I'm saying. I'm noticing, migration, displacement, and I ask myself, and ask us to think about how we here in our everyday, through the very simple privilege of opening up a water faucet and having clean water come out of that, or having sanitation services or electricity, or clothes, food at a reasonable rate. Like how are we complicit, and what is currently displacing people worldwide? Does anybody else have a question from the group? And I know, Giovanni, you had a question for me, so I just want to open up the space in case anybody else has a comment, a question, and if there's anything from Giovanni's presentation that didn't make sense, or you want to get a little more info on because you didn't get to see the visual for it, please feel free to ask. We're beginning to talk about identity and history, and the purpose of the East to West project is to talk about those things and also some of the things that maybe we experience on a daily basis that don't get named so easily, such as anti-Blackness. And, you know, I think for myself, you know, I am asking, you know, what is the color of displacement, for example? How does race tie in with class and colorism and nationality and status? So that is a question that I'm asking, especially as I'm seeing many more folks of darker shades being displaced currently because of the new waves that we're experiencing. So these are just some prácticas that you can consider for yourself or your community as you engage with people that you know about Latinidad. What is it? How do we talk about Blackness in a way that isn't upholding racism or colorism or colonialism? So first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that it's a practice, right? That I think that even if you think you know, you probably don't know, and kind of holding a space for that kind of I don't know, or I don't know everything, or I can't really know ever. Just this constant space of inquiry and humbleness, right? To acknowledge that every person's experience is unique and different, and that none of us can speak for each other. And what does it mean to center you know, folks that are Black or identify as Black. So these are some of the ways that I do that in my own practice. And the first one is just to step to the side. Step to the side and know that the spotlight is not on me, about me, per se, except that there's a lot of ambivalence, there's a lot of lack of words, a lot of pain, a lot of trauma that comes with talking about experiences related to Blackness or Afro-descendancy for many people, that it's incumbent on us to say something when we see or hear something that is anti-Black. And what that is, I think, is a part of our homework. Like, when do we know that that is being expressed is part of our homework, to learn to listen with those detailed ears. Make room for people. So make room for people to speak for themselves, make room for people to step into their own power, exercise their own power. Make room for people to just be. Make room for people to be as is without any additional expectations or standards. Let people just be and repeat. Again, it's a practice and it doesn't begin or end in any particular place. So these are some questions that I wrote for folks. Maybe they can be takeaways. What does acknowledging our roots with integrity and equity look like? How do we not put our grandmothers in the corner? How do we hold ourselves accountable? Everyday actions, baby steps, or big steps if you're in a position of power where you're able to influence other people, most definitely. And who is missing from the table, and what does this table look like? So oftentimes in the US, for example, we talk about Black and white as this very rigid binary, but there's a lot of people in between. And depending on who you ask, maybe the table is on the floor, or it's inside of a teepee, or the table is the river or a mountain. So talking with people about how they identify with their own power or not, I think is also important. And just to kind of close us off and reflect on, the moment that we are living in, we are experiencing a lot of grief, trauma, pain, hopefully not in silence. And it's okay to acknowledge those things, and also acknowledge, the continuing violence that we see taking place on Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, migrant bodies. So I'm going to play this video in solidarity with George Floyd.
Home, ain't got no shoes, ain't got no money, ain't got no class, Ain't got no skirts, ain't got no sweaters, ain't got no perfume, ain't got no love, ain't got no faith. I ain't got no culture, ain't got no mother, ain't got no...
This is a video from Afrodescendencias Mexico. So we know a little bit about Brazil. We know a little bit about Haiti, Dominican Republic. There are some region spaces, other stories that we don't know as well. And so I think, you know, how do we get to learn each other's stories, share these stories, and connect to other people's stories as Afro-Mexicans are doing in solidarity with George Floyd and other Black peoples throughout the world. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time to listen to us speak. And if you have any questions, feel free to stay on. You can also type those into the chat group. Please send us your email. If you would like to stay in touch with the East to West Project, send us your email if you'd like the presentation that Giovanni shared. If you'd like a PDF coffee, it's time for coffee, copy of that. Please stay up to date with East to West programming. All of the events are available on Facebook, and this video will be hopefully available on YouTube afterwards. Giovanni, any last words?
Stay strong and be aware and refuse to not know. Do your homework and take action.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you so much.
Ain't got no shoes, ain't got no money, ain't got no class, ain't got